Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my June wrap up. June was a very up and down month for me, so there were a lot of DNFs and low stars, but there were also some really high highs, some really interesting books that really changed my mind about things, and so it was a bit of a mixed bag, but I'm really excited to talk about all of them and share with you my thoughts. And let's get started. So, of course, as always, I'm going to be starting off with the books that I did not finish, all the way up until the best books of the month. And the best books of the month are a little bit like I could swap one for the other, but you could also check out the chart that I made at the very end, and then it will tell you kind of my final ranking on things because even while I'm editing, sometimes it just changes it. So we'll figure it out as we go along. But one thing is for certain, did DNF some books, and these I feel very strongly about. So let's get started. The first one I finished was The Serpent and the Wolf by Rebecca Robinson. This is a romantasy book about a woman who is promised to marry a neighboring kingdom's prince. This is a part of her brother's political machinations for their kingdom. She doesn't want to be married. So what she ends up doing is that she escapes the palace on her wedding night. But the prince ends up finding her, and they make sort of a temporary alliance. He will teach her more about how to use her magical abilities, and then she will help him gain power in his kingdom. I personally did not even get to the part where they make their temporary alliance because it was so cringy and uninspired. I thought, the summary was very interesting because she does escape on her wedding night, so that can lead to so many different possibilities, right? But the prince finds her within the first 2 weeks of her leaving. Like, are you joking with me? Are you absolutely kidding me? Right? So there's absolutely no tension there, absolutely no stakes, no nothing. So that was really annoying as well. And I continue to have a very toxic relationship with romantasy because, again, I see so many cool possibilities for the story. I see so many ways like the plot could go, the romance could go, but it just ends up being so uninspired and so cringy. And I don't know what it is with that romantasy that I just noticed, but there's always these very cringy, like faux girl bossy kind of one liners that they all say. Like, for example, there was this one part in the part that I read where she talks about how I think she wants like power or something like that, but no one expects her to have it because she is a woman. And I think she says a line about like, yeah, and like men only get the power because of the bits dangling between their legs. And I'm like, girl, are you serious? Like, whatever it is, like, I don't know, right? It's so like it's like that meme where it's like, oh, they're in like a historical piece or period drama, but they look like they use like iPhones, right? And I think all of the romantasy category could be categorized like this because they all use like cringy faux girl boss liners from like 2026 and insert them into like a fantasy like world. And there's just so much like cognitive dissonance in there for me that it just doesn't work. I feel like it would be better if they made it into like urban fantasy, but alas, they didn't. So it just the romantasy genre just kills me, and yet I continue to try and read from it and figure out something that I like from it. So I think that's probably on me. The next book that I DNF'd was Wicked by Gregory Maguire. This one is very interesting to me because I did really enjoy watching the play when I was in New York, and I enjoyed it so much that I wanted to go back to the source material for the book, right? So the play was based on the book. And of course, this book is basically almost like a rewrite of The Wizard of Oz if it was written from the Wicked Witch of the West's perspective on things. And so it tries to give like a more nuanced view on who the Wicked Witch is. Like, is she actually wicked? Like, what is her whole backstory, right? And I think that because of that, Gregory Maguire tries to introduce more nuance in terms of and exploring social commentary about religion and politics and societal judgment on our appearance and things like that. Uh, but to be honest, I really think it was just a me problem because the writing is confusing. It is confusing. And I think it kind of like it's almost like it was like too slow and then went in and then it got exciting and then it was like and then it became slow again and then the whole world building was just a little too confused. It's honestly very difficult to explain this book and why I didn't get along with it. I think it really just comes down to the writing. It just got really confusing and I can understand what Gregory Maguire was getting at in terms of like the commentary. Didn't quite like get there, but like then again, I quit at like the 15% mark basically. So I don't know. I think I kind of lost my enthusiasm for it, so I don't think I will be continuing on with it. The next book that I DNF'd was My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. I'm so sad about this one because this is like a booktube darling. This is a literary fiction darling. And I really wanted to read this one too so I could watch the TV show. But I'm so sad. I just did not get along with this one. And again, I think it is also a me problem with this one. Essentially, this book is about female friendship between these two girls who live in 1950s Naples. Again, I think that it was just overly repetitive and some people say that the writing is just a bit too like detached and it's hard to feel connected to the story, and I felt the exact same way. I just thought it was just a little too detached. It was just too stagnant almost in its prose, and this could be a translation problem as well. um but to me, like, the translation was just really choppy, repetitive and stagnant, and I just thought that it wasn't worth slogging through essentially, and which is really disappointing because again, there were moments in this book where I thought, wow, that was really beautiful, or I really liked how they portrayed like female friendship. I think the writing just didn't work for me once again, and it's really sad. This is one of the ones where I DNF it and I just feel really sad because I want to like it like everyone else does, but alas, here we are. I thought that once it got to somewhere poignant, it just kind of like stopped there. And those were the moments when I would really ask myself, like, hey, I would really love to know more about that one particular scenario and like what people thought about it and things like that. But then it just kind of went to the next thing. The last book that I DNF'd was The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This is a classic horror novel. This one is about a governess who goes into a house to take care of two young children. She ends up seeing a ghost, and the interesting part is that we don't know whether or not it's a ghost or a product of her imagination. I was promised, I think, a psychological novel from this book, right? It's kind of like, do you know whether or not she is actually seeing a ghost, or is this just like a product of her imagination, what she wants to see, and things like that? But it honestly reminds me of like all these episodes of the X Files where they truly want you to believe that there's something more than psychological here, right? The issue is that the psychological aspect of things then gets kind of pushed aside, and it's almost like the person who believes in the science looks stupid. Like, and it's like really clear that like the supernatural is more of like the correct answer. I could be wrong on that, but it really does feel like that. It really felt like an episode of the X Files in that sense. And to me, it just wasn't that interesting because I don't I don't have enough insight into her character as to why she would even believe that there is something psychological going on with her. For example, there's no real reason why the governor should be acting the way that she does. She really has no motivation other than the fact that she wants to protect these two children. Why? I don't really know why. And and then there would be kind of like this like rehash of things. Like she would see something that maybe she thought she didn't see, and she wanted to confirm it with like the people of the house or the other servants of the house, and then there would be kind of like this like rehash of things, and then it just got really repetitive in my opinion, and I think it really like downplayed the suspense of the book, and I didn't find it that scary like at all. I thought that the writing was pretty decent, and in the moments when she thought that she did see a ghost, I thought the writing really pulled that scariness out of it, but I just don't think it was enough. I do think that this was an important novel of its time, and I'm sure it must have been more suspenseful and more mind blowing at the time. But to me, after reading, a lot of psychological novels and horror novels, this one is just kind of, and so I just didn't think that I wanted to continue on with it. That one was a little sad because it is such a classic novel, but alas, not every classic novel is for you, I guess, is what I learned from that. Okay, so moving on to the books that I actually finished and completed from worst to best. The first kind of series that I read was Firefly Wedding. This one, again, I talked about a little bit about this in my May wrap up, but I finished the whole entire arc of it in June. This series is a manga. It is about a princess who essentially gets kidnapped and is meant to be assassinated and killed. However, one of the men that was supposed to kill her decides that he doesn't want to kill her, but he basically whisks her away, and they end up on this like island of brothels, and they have to kind of figure out a way to get off of the island basically, and in the process the two of them fell in love. It was very apparent to me, like the more and more that I went on with this series, the less and less I liked it, and it was mostly because I just thought the plot just got crazier and crazier. It lost more and more of its logical sense as the plot twists kept coming. I wanted it to focus more on the relationship between the two main characters, but instead it kind of like got like derailed, and like there were more external factors affecting the relationship, and so like their their relationships just kind of came to like a standstill in my opinion. I also thought that he disrespected her wishes like one too many times. It was kind of insane. And in the end, I was left wondering why she even liked the guy, to be honest. She also barely kind of had any personality, in my opinion. And then they also introduced a bunch of secondary characters that would only stay for like a volume or so, and then they would kind of just leave, or they weren't important to begin with, or their motivation just became nonsensical to the way that they were introduced. So that really detracted a lot from my enjoyment of the series, and then I ended up just not liking it at all. And I also thought the ending was really meh to me. I really felt like it was like a safe choice to make, and I think I could have gone further. It didn't really have to be that safe, but I understand if people want like a happy ending. But personally, I think that the not safe choice might have been more maybe interesting. But by that point, I just didn't care anymore either. So that's Firefly Wedding. The next book I read was Things in Nature Merely Grow by Yiyun Li. This one is a memoir essentially about a woman whose two sons committed a suicide, and this is kind of her story and her feelings about grief essentially, and how she felt about what happened to her. I okay, I would like to preface this by saying that what happened to her is something extremely tragic, and it should not happen to any parent. I am judging this book merely on the writing of the book and how I feel that her message could have been better written. So, this is about how the book is written and how I think it could have been stronger, but not judging her because of the plight that she was in. So, just to make that clear. But in terms of how it was written, I did not like this book at all, which is very interesting to me because I did watch an interview with her on CNN, and that book elicited more emotion in me and more emotion in her than I ever read in this book. Like she should just have put her transcript of that interview into a book, and I think that would have been great. Um, I think I think there was a bit of an expectation issue with this book. What I think I wanted from this book was a story about, her two sons, their family dynamic, what their relationship was like with each other. Things I got from the other memoir that I read, Mom's memoir, and she was the mom of one of the shooters of the Columbine shooting. So I do think that maybe I was expecting a certain story. I wanted more information about like their mental health, like what their family was like, what their relationships were, what her children were like. And I think what I got instead was a very pretentious expose on grief and her knowledge of literature and her references to literature, because she is a professor at Yale, as she mentions in the book. A lot of like stringing together of like pretentious words and things like that in order to kind of talk about her feelings. But it ended up, I think, sounding really insincere to me. I never really got a good sense of like who her sons were, aside from how smart they were and how much literature they could quote and things like that. And I didn't learn anything about them. I don't And at the end of the book, I had no idea who they were. And it's also very clear to me that she also has a pretty traumatic past with her own abusive mom. She goes on to say that she, wants to live a life of thinking, like one of her sons, and a life of radical acceptance, accepting that her sons wanted to kill themselves and wanted to commit suicide. And she says that she is kind of radically accepting that they're going to die and there's nothing she could do about it or did do about it, really. It just really felt like a denial of her feelings, to be honest. Like, you can accept things and still accept your own emotions about it, but it really seemed like she was just kind of denying everything that came along with it, in my personal opinion. It's very clear to me that it seems like she really wants to detach herself from the feelings that kind of go along with it. I think she loses a lot of agency that way, and I don't really think that's the answer, to be honest. And um, I really do feel like I came out of it not really knowing um, just a lot about her, um, which kind of was like the whole point of me reading this book in the first place. I also thought a lot of it was really choppy. It would go from like one instance to the next instance to the next instance, and there was no sense of chronology. It just really felt like vignettes, which I think was a detriment to the book as well. So to be honest, I really don't recommend this book, but I will say that I am in the minority on this one, and my opinion is in the minority. A lot of people really love this book, so take my opinion with a grain of salt. And then I read The Long Winter by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This is the sixth book in the Laura Ingalls Wilder series, again, with the second book being Little House on the Prairie. I absolutely love this book, which is very interesting because it's quite a it's almost like a really depressing book if you really stop and think about it. Um, I just love the way Laura Ingalls Wilder makes just regular life sound so interesting. And back then it really was interesting. And it was hard. This book is all about how Laura and her family start to live back in town. And so she and her family live in town. However, they get stuck in basically like a 7-month long winter. And then the trains stop coming like January because the trains would get snowed in, and then the people would have to dig out the train, and then to be really dangerous, only for it to like snow again. So really, the town was starving, and they had to really like ration out food and things like that in order to survive the winter. So it's some scary stuff, and it just really reminds me of kind of how good we've got it, to be honest. Again, I know I said that before, but it's just kind of insane. I there was this one part in the book where people are trying to go home from school in the blizzard, and what happens is like if you get lost out in the snow, there's a good chance that you could die out there and no one would find you, which I thought was really interesting but also really scary. Again, Laura Ingalls Wilder really makes like it sound so mundane, and this was kind of her daily life, but she made it sound again so interesting as well. And there were pockets of hopefulness and like family life that is always really interesting to me, just like a small piece of history back then, and it's just so fascinating to read about and to learn about. The next book I read was She Who Remains by Renee Carabash, and this was translated by Isadora Angel. This is a literary fiction novel that was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize this year. This is a book about a girl who becomes a sworn virgin in Albania. Now, basically, what a sworn virgin is that in these kind of small villages in Albania, it operates under a very patriarchal rule, right? So whatever you might expect that comes along with that. So again, men and boys are the only ones really allowed to have a voice and a say in family politics, in the outside world. Boys were very much lauded and wanted, whereas girls were the opposite. And basically, sworn virgins were girls who swear to be virgins and essentially become boys. And this was allowed and this was accepted as a custom in these small villages in Albania, because if you essentially become a sworn virgin and you want to be a boy, then you could take over as head of the family. So some families who didn't have any boys, some of the daughters would do this in order to take care of the family, essentially. They also did it for other reasons as well, to escape marriages, to be able to do some of the boy jobs, like taking care of the farm and animals and things like that they wanted to do. So there were I think that's such an interesting premise, right? Because then there's just so many different questions you could ask about the nature of gender, the nature of culture and customs, and who is it helping, who is it not? How do these customs come to be, and are they even necessary and wanted? Um, so just so many questions that I think was very interesting. And this book is about maybe a fictional version of a girl who wants to become a sworn virgin. When she was born, her father was very upset that she was born a girl because he really wanted a boy. But the interesting part is that when there was a boy that was born into the family, her younger brother, his personality is very much more what we would consider to be more feminine. So he would be really sensitive to things. He didn't want to kill animals. He would rather stay inside and do like write or do other things like that. The girl that was born loved to do a lot of the things that the chores that like boys would be expected to do, like going outside, cutting wood, taking care of the animals, and all of that stuff. So her father ended up being disappointed in the both of them. The writing in this book is very interesting because it's written like in a very poetry like manner, which unfortunately triggered me a little bit because in a lot of young adult novels, you have a kind of like a paragraph or like a sentence, and then if you want to emphasize something, you would just write a singular sentence, and then you would move back into the whatever you wanted to write, right? I really think that you don't need to separate things like that in order to emphasize it. I personally think it's kind of a cheap way to put emphasis on something, and unfortunately, this happened so much in this book. I also thought that the plot became super melodramatic as it came on, and it just came to this almost point of like disbelief, in my opinion, and almost like wish fulfillment y. And a lot of people also complained in the reviews that this is an author that didn't even hadn't even gone to Albania, and because of that a lot of the descriptions of the place and the atmosphere and the culture are vague, which I totally agree with, and I could definitely see that. I wish there was more just information about what it's like to be a sworn virgin, essentially. I really could put this story from Albania to modern day, and there really wouldn't be much difference because it's lacking in such specifics. So I personally wish that there was more about what it'd be like to live as a foreign virgin, what it's like to live in that kind of environment, and things like that. But again, I really didn't get anything new from this book, which I was really hoping that I would. So that's a bummer. And I do think that I think it just needed more. And I think it needed to tone down on the melodramaticness of it all here at the end. So that was kind of my issue with this. And I'm also in the minority on this one. The next book I read was So Late in the Day by Claire Keegan. This is a collection of short stories about men and women, essentially, and the way they interact with each other. This is my first Claire Keegan novel, and I'm really excited to read more, honestly, because she writes absolutely beautifully. The way that she writes dialogue is just so straightforward and concise, but it just tells you so much about the characters. And it also tells me a lot about how much she knows about the dynamics between men and women, especially especially in the first story, um, about a relationship between a man and a woman, and how they're both perceived by each other, and how that affects the both of them, and how did that dynamic come about, right? So it's talking a little bit about trauma and how uh, our parents influence to be the way that we are today. So there's a lot of that as well. So I really enjoyed this one. I didn't quite enjoy the other stories as much as the first one, but again, this makes me very excited to read more Claire Keegan. Um, so in that sense, I think these short stories really succeeded. So excited to read more from her. And now we're getting into the top two books. The second book I wanted to talk about, it's more that this book ended up here because it really, I think, changed my mind about a lot of things, and it's such a devastating piece of work, and that is The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. This is a horror novel that follows a kind of small town. I think kind of like 80s Stephen King vibes, where there's like a lot of these friendships with boys and they're going out and hanging out, and it's kind of coming of age in that way. So it's written from the perspective of one of the boys named David. David lives in this small town. He has a couple of guy friends. He knows everyone in this small town. Two of his friends live next door, and their mother ends up adopting these two girls that their parents died, and I think their parents are related to the mom in some way. I forgot what, but you know, the mom Ruth ends up taking these two girls in to live with them, and the story kind of goes from there. And what happens is that Ruth slowly starts to treat Meg and Susan, the two girls, poorly. And then it becomes so bad that Ruth ends up putting Meg into the basement and torturing her. And it's all about like being a bystander, internalized misogyny. As I was reading this book, I kept coming back to thinking about my favorite book of all time, A Little Life, and how people think that that book is very gratuitous in its violence. I would like this people to read this book because the violence in this book was almost like unbearable to me because I was reading and I'd be halfway through the book and I was already like almost done with the book and I was like there's more that's going to happen and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse and worse. There was like a ball in my stomach the whole time that I was reading this book. And guess what? This book is based on a true story. And the author even says in his foreword that I had to take away some of the things that I written in this book because even though it happened in real life, it was just too much to put in the book. It doesn't tell you how scary real life is compared to books. Like, I don't know what will. Because if I read this and I didn't read the foreword, I would be like, heck no, like, this would never happen in real life. Well, I can believe it. But to that extent, maybe not. But it did. And I think that's the most tragic thing of all. The story was based on the story of Sylvia Likens, who was also taken in by a woman, and she was slowly, tortured until she died. I do think that this book brings to life, though, the perspective of someone who is on the outside looking in and witnessing this torture, right? What it's like to be a bystander, what is going on in that head of his, and just viewing people as other, right? And by viewing other people as other, we really detach ourselves from helping them. There was a lot of internalized misogyny that was discussed from Ruth's perspective as well, and I thought that was really, really well written. I also thought the pacing was really, really good. You're like begging David to do something. You also understand why he doesn't. It really also talks about how trauma is like passed down and not in a very like in your face kind of way. So honestly, I thought this book was just really well written in general. And contrary to what the title might have you believe, it is just absolutely scary. But it's not a popcorn kind of horror novel. There's some real depth into this book that I really didn't expect again because of the cover, because of just like the cheesiness of the cover too. I thought it was just gonna be like jump scare type of thing. But it wasn't. Again, it's much scarier than any type of horror novel because it's based on humans and what humans can do, and that shit is always scarier than anything supernatural, in my personal opinion. This book is really hard to swallow. I don't recommend it to everyone. It's got basically everything horrible in terms of torture that you can imagine, and but again, I thought it was just such an important book to read and something that will really stay in my mind for a really long time. And then the last book, I think my favorite book of the month is A Brief History of Humankind by Noah Kaval. This is actually a nonfiction book. Again, about, as you can see, a brief history of humankind. I think from a more like sociological perspective, the main question that he is trying to answer in this book is, how did humans learn to collaborate with each other, right? How did we get from these hunter-gatherer tribes of small family units to very large scale global collaboration and working in communities and governments and churches and things like that on a larger scale? There's obviously more to this book than that. He, goes on a deep dive on the different types of Homo sapiens, again, how we learn the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, um, and his perspective on that. I thought this book really changed my mind as well because he talks about, we always think of the phrase, we gotta learn from history because history repeats itself, right? And he makes the argument that, there's too many possibilities and variations for maybe history to repeat itself, and to maybe learn from history. We should learn from history because there's so much possibility to it. And there's so many possibilities in which we could live, and so much of it is coincidence that the way that we live doesn't have to be the way that we live. So, like for example, when he talks about the agricultural revolution, he talks about how the agricultural revolution was actually detrimental to humans in many, many ways, from like our back pain to having us work more hours, to isolating ourselves from community and all of those things. It wasn't necessarily a good thing for us to turn into sort of an agricultural people. And I thought that was just so fascinating because, again, I just came out of this book really understanding that so much of history is coincidental. And there's just so much possibility for the way that we can live our lives, in our imaginations and the ones that we have now. And again, he talks a lot about how humans can collaborate through money, through religion, through all these different types of things. It just really is so fascinating because of the things we have to tell ourselves in order to live together as a big global group. He tells it in such a really, really compelling and engaging way. And this just makes me really excited to read more nonfiction as well. So, highly, highly recommend this book. We'll say, like, it's not very historically accurate. He's drawing extrapolations from things. But in my personal opinion, a lot of sociological studies are not really, can't really be based on much data than the ones that we know. A lot of this stuff we really do have to extrapolate, and his is just one opinion, amongst a sea of others. But I do think that his opinion really did change the way that I think about history and I think about our future. So, highly, highly recommend that one. It was a great book to read in the month of June. So those were all the books that I read. Again, I had some really high highs and books that really changed my mind about things, but then also books that just were just so bad. It's just an interesting to try different things and learn about what I like. And same goes for next month, this month as well, which is July. So can't wait to talk to you until then, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.